Udham Singh, the Martyr of Amritsar. Part I, a child of loss and fire. The winter sun of December 1899 rose faintly over the fields of Punjab, casting its pale gold over the dusty village of Sunam. On the morning of the 26th, the cries of a newborn filled the modest home of Tehal Singh and his wife, Naran Kaur. They named the child Sher Singh, a name meant to carry the strength of a lion. Yet no name, no blessing, could shield him from the storms that fate would hurl upon his young life. Sher's father, Tehal Singh, belonged to the Kamboj community, men known not for privilege but for their endurance in labor. He was not a landlord nor a man of letters, but a worker whose hands bore calluses from endless toil. He worked on the canals of Punjab, carrying mud, stone, and exhaustion as the British carved their projects into the land. Later, he became a railway crossing guard in the village of Upali, standing by the tracks with a flag and whistle, ensuring trains passed safely. It was a life of survival, not prosperity, a life of sacrifice for the children he adored. Naran Kaur, by contrast, carried a gentleness that balanced the family's hardship. In her embrace, Sher and his elder brother, Sadhu, found warmth, laughter, and lullabies, sung in the soft tones of Punjab's folk songs. But happiness is often fleeting, especially in homes where hunger is never far. When Sher was barely 3 years old and Sadhu no more than 5, Narain's voice fell silent forever. Illness took her swiftly, leaving behind not only grief, but a hollow emptiness in the hearts of her boys. For Tehal Singh, life became a battle against despair. With both sons clinging to him, he carried his sorrow like a hidden wound and pressed forward. They followed him from place to place, their small feet padding after his weary stride as he labored in Punjab's fields and construction sites. Sher and Sadhu did not have toys or books, but they had the companionship of each other and the quiet strength of a father determined to keep them afloat. But the threads of fate were merciless. In October 1907, when Sher was just 7 years old, Tehal Singh set out for Amritsar with his 2 boys. Perhaps he sought a better chance, perhaps only worked to keep them fed. The journey was long, and the road unforgiving. Days of walking under the unforgiving sun wore him down until his body simply gave in. On the roadside near Rambagh Hospital, his legs buckled. Before the frightened eyes of his sons, the father who had carried their lives on his shoulders breathed his last. For Sher and Sadhu, the world shattered. The little hands that had clutched their father's kurta were now empty. They were orphans too young to survive alone, too small to fight the vast indifference of the world. Their uncle took them in briefly, but poverty pressed on every side, and he could not bear the burden. Reluctantly, with hearts heavy, the boys were led to the gates of the Central Khalsa orphanage in Amritsar. It was 28 October 1907 when the orphanage's register recorded their arrival. Sher Singh, a boy with wide, sorrowful eyes, was given a new identity. In the Sikh tradition, he was rebaptized and renamed Udham Singh, a name meaning the upheaval, the storm. His brother Sadhu became Mukta, meaning liberated from rebirth. The names were more than ritual, they were prophecies. One would be freed from the cycle of suffering by death, the other would rise as a tempest to shake an empire. Within the orphanage walls, Udham became Uday, a name spoken with affection by caretakers and fellow orphans. Yet behind his bright smile lingered an unspoken pain. Nights were the hardest when the cries of children missing their parents filled the dormitories, when memories of his mother's songs and father's rough but loving hands haunted his dreams. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, discipline was strict. But the orphanage gave what little it could: food, shelter, the basics of education, and above all, survival. In that place of abandonment, Uday's spirit hardened. Loss became his first teacher, teaching him resilience, and grief became his constant companion. He watched as children came and went, some adopted, others lost to illness. He clung to his brother Mukta, his only bond of blood left in the world. They studied together, worked together, prayed together, two brothers, adrift but inseparable. But once again, tragedy came like a thief in the night. In 1917, when Udham was just 18, his brother fell ill. The sickness was sudden, cruel, and relentless. Within days, Mukta was gone. Udham stood at his funeral pyre, the flames reflecting in his tear-streaked eyes. With his brother's passing, he lost not only his last family, but also the last thread tying him to the innocence of childhood. From that day forward, Udham Singh belonged to no one and nothing except his destiny. The orphanage had given him survival, but it had also taught him something more profound. He understood suffering in a way that few could. He understood what it meant to be forgotten, abandoned, and stripped of every comfort. And in that understanding lay the seed of defiance. The world had taken everything from him. He would one day demand everything back, not for himself, but for his people. The boy who had entered the orphanage as Sher Singh, the cub of a lion, emerged as Udham Singh, the upheaval. The name was not just a label, it was a warning. And so began the journey of a child born of loss, forged in grief, and destined to carve his name into the history of a nation. Part 2. A soldier before his time. The year was 1917. The world was aflame with war. Far away in Europe, trenches swallowed men alive, cannons thundered day and night, and the earth itself seemed to bleed. In the villages of Punjab, whispers of that war drifted across the fields. The British Crown had called upon its colonies to supply not only grain but flesh. Young Indian men were enlisted in droves, some by choice, many by coercion. To the empire, they were not sons, brothers, or fathers. They were numbers, fuel for its battles. In Amritsar, inside the orphanage walls, a restless fire burned within the heart of Udham Singh. He was no longer the frail child clinging to his father's kurta or weeping over his brother's funeral pyre. At 18, grief had shaped him into a man with piercing eyes, a wiry frame, and a hunger for meaning. He looked at the British recruiters, not with fear, but with something darker: defiance, curiosity, and a strange yearning to test his own strength. Though he was still below the official age of enlistment, Udham was determined. Perhaps he sought escape from the suffocating walls of the orphanage. Perhaps he sought purpose. Or perhaps, somewhere deep inside, he understood that to know his enemy, he must first walk among them. Whatever the reason, he stood before the authorities and persuaded them through stubborn will and fearless eyes to accept him. Thus, Udham Singh entered the ranks of the 31 Sikh pioneers. But his fate was unlike that of those who dreamed of glory. The empire did not place a rifle in his hands or a badge on his chest. Instead, they gave him a shovel, a hammer, and the endless weight of manual labor. He was sent to toil on the field railways from the coast of Basra into the heart of Mesopotamia, where the war stretched into deserts and rivers unknown to him. The heat was merciless. The sun seared his skin as he and other Indian recruits carried timber, repaired tracks, and hauled supplies. At night, he lay on the hard earth, listening to the rumble of distant gunfire. He saw men of his own land treated as expendable laborers, while white officers barked orders from horseback. There was no honor, no valor, only sweat, hunger, and the sting of humiliation. Udham's temper, already sharpened by years of loss, flared against the condescension of authority. He clashed with officers, his youth making him impatient, his pride unwilling to bow. He was a soldier by name, but his heart refused servitude. Within 6 months, he was back in Punjab, restless and unfulfilled, the soil of his homeland calling him back. But restlessness is a fire not easily extinguished. In 1918, Udham enlisted once again, this time determined to endure. He was dispatched back to Mesopotamia, to Basra, and then Baghdad. The war was nearing its end, but its machinery still demanded hands to repair, build, and carry. Udham found himself working on carpentry and general maintenance of machinery and vehicles. Grease blackened his hands, and sawdust clung to his clothes. But his eyes absorbed everything: the rhythm of engines, the mechanics of machines, the organization of armies. The British thought they had given him labor. In truth, they had given him knowledge. For a year, Udham lived in that foreign land, surrounded by war yet untouched by its glory. He watched Indian soldiers bleed for a king they had never seen, fighting in a conflict that was not theirs. He listened to their curses, their laments, their songs of homesickness under the desert moon, and slowly a conviction settled in him. The empire had no love for India. It used Indians as tools, nothing more. When he returned to Amritsar in early 1919, the war had ended. The world celebrated victory, but in Punjab, hunger and despair lingered. The empire had bled India, dry grain had been taken to feed British troops, taxes had been raised, and fields lay barren. Udham walked once more into the orphanage, but he was not the same man who had left. His shoulders carried not only the scars of labor, but also the heavy awareness that his people's suffering was deliberate, designed, and endless. The war had taught him more than how to build railways or repair machines. It had taught him the futility of serving masters who despised his people. It had revealed to him the machinery of empire, the cold efficiency with which it consumed lives. And yet, destiny had not finished with him. For, while he wrestled with his disillusionment, a storm was about to break over Amritsar, one that would forever brand his soul with fire. Udham Singh had returned just in time to witness the event that would change the course of his life. Within weeks, the streets of Amritsar would be drenched in blood, the cries of thousands rising into the sky. He would stand amid the carnage of Jallianwala Bagh, and the boy who had known only personal loss would come to know the collective agony of a nation. But that was yet to come. For now, Udham was a young man, scarred but searching, standing at the edge of history. The orphan had walked into the world's greatest war and returned with a truth carved into his bones. India's freedom would never be given, it had to be seized. The soldier who had carried spades and engines was readying himself for a much greater burden, the burden of vengeance. Part 3. The Blood of Baisakhi. The spring of 1919 should have been a season of renewal. In Punjab, fields swayed with golden wheat, the harvest promising abundance. The festival of Baisakhi, when farmers brought in their crops and communities gathered in gratitude, was meant to be a time of joy. But beneath the songs of celebration, a shadow loomed. The British government, fearful of India's growing unrest, had passed the Rowlatt Act, a law that stripped away civil liberties, allowing arrests without trial, detentions without cause. The people of Punjab felt the sting of betrayal. They had given their sons to the Great War, spilled their blood for the empire, filled its coffers with grain, and yet, instead of gratitude, they received chains. Leaders who spoke against the act, men like Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, were arrested and whisked away without explanation. Amritsar simmered with anger. Crowds gathered in protest, demanding justice. The British responded with bullets. On 10 April, a military picket opened fire on demonstrators. Riots erupted. Banks owned by Europeans were attacked, as were government buildings. Fear rippled through the colonial administration. And so, on the eve of Baisakhi, Amritsar was placed under military control. But the people would not be silenced. On 13 April 1919, as the sun climbed high, over 20,000 men, women, and children poured into Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden surrounded by high brick walls. Some came to celebrate Baisakhi, carrying food and laughter. Others came to protest peacefully, to demand the release of their leaders. There were farmers in corstotas, shopkeepers in turbans, mothers with children clinging to their dupattas. The atmosphere was one of defiant hope. Among them was Udham Singh, then just 19. He had returned from Mesopotamia months earlier, his body weary, but his spirit restless. With his companions from the orphanage, he had volunteered to serve water to the thirsty. They moved through the crowd with clay pitchers, offering cool relief in the afternoon heat, unaware that history was about to turn the soil beneath their feet into a graveyard. At about 5:30 p.m., the tranquility shattered. Colonel Reginald Dyer, the acting brigadier general, marched into the garden with 90 armed soldiers. The entrance to Jallianwala Bagh was narrow, a bottleneck. Once inside, Dyer ordered it sealed. The crowd, unarmed and unsuspecting, had no idea of what was to come. Without issuing a warning, without asking the people to disperse, Dyer raised his hand and gave the order. Fire. The rifles cracked, one after another, the sound tearing through the air. Bullets rained into the packed crowd. Panic surged like a tidal wave. Mothers screamed as their children fell. Men tried to shield their wives. Bodies collapsed in heaps. People scrambled toward the walls, only to realize there was no escape. The walls loomed too high. The gates were sealed. Some leapt desperately into the well at the corner of the garden, piling on top of one another until water turned to a grave. Dyer's men kept firing 10 minutes of unrelenting slaughter. They aimed deliberately at the thickest parts of the crowd, at the exits where people tried to flee. They fired until their ammunition was nearly exhausted, over 600 rounds in total. When the smoke cleared, silence fell like a shroud. The ground was littered with bodies, men, women, children, hundreds dead, thousands wounded. Blood seeped into the soil, staining it forever. And in that silence, standing among the corpses, was Udham Singh. He had come with pitchers of water, but now his hands were empty, trembling. He had seen men shot through the chest, children trampled in the stampede, women clutching lifeless infants. The cries echoed in his ears, etching themselves into his very marrow. For hours, survivors tried to tend to the wounded. No doctor was allowed in. No help was offered. The British curfew forced the dying to lie on the ground until morning, their groans piercing the night. Udham remained, his heart breaking, his spirit burning. The memory of his parents' deaths, his brother's absence, all the personal sorrows he had endured, none compared to this. This was not fate, nor illness, nor chance. This was deliberate. This was murder sanctioned by empire. That night, as he washed the blood from his hands, Udham Singh swore an oath. The massacre at Jallianwala Bagh would not be forgotten. The man who had ordered it, and the man who defended it, Michael O'Dwyer, the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, would one day pay. From that day forward, Udham Singh's life was no longer his own. He had seen too much, lost too much. He carried with him not only the pain of an orphan, but the collective grief of a people. The soil of Jallianwala Bagh, soaked with blood, had claimed him as its avenger. Years later, in court, when asked why he had done what he did, Udham Singh would answer, For full 21 years, I have been trying to seek vengeance. I am happy that I have done the job. I am not afraid of death. I am dying for my country. But on that April evening in 1919, he was still only a boy, standing amidst the carnage, the pitchers of water at his side, his eyes fixed on the walls still scarred with bullet holes. He walked away that night, not as Udham Singh, the orphan, but as Udham Singh, the upheaval and avenger born from blood. Part 4. Seeds of Rebellion. The massacre at Jallianwala Bagh had left Punjab scarred beyond healing. The earth itself seemed to remember. The bullet marks on the walls remained, mute witnesses to the crime. For Udham Singh, the horror was not a memory but a wound that bled every time he breathed. The massacre had transformed grief into purpose, and purpose into obsession. In the months that followed, Amritsar simmered with rage. Protests erupted, voices rose, and British troops tightened their grip on the city. Yet even under surveillance, revolution sprouted like wild grass between stones. Men whispered in secret gatherings. Young students passed leaflets in the dead of night. And songs of freedom drifted from lips too brave to be silenced. It was in this atmosphere that Udham's restless fire found its home. The influence of Bhagat Singh. Among the voices that reached him most powerfully was that of Bhagat Singh. Only a few years younger, Bhagat was already a legend in the making, a revolutionary whose clarity of thought and courage of action electrified a generation. His words were sharp as steel, his vision of independence uncompromising. Though Udham and Bhagat never fought side by side in the same operations, Udham felt Bhagat's influence like a current in the air. He read the pamphlets, the speeches, the calls to arms. "Revolution is not a word," Bhagat declared. "It is a spirit." Udham absorbed those words, carrying them like scripture. He began to see that the vengeance he longed for was not only personal but part of a greater struggle, the struggle to break India's chains. The Ghadar Party. By 1924, Udham Singh had taken his step into organized rebellion. He gravitated toward the Ghadar Party, a movement of Indian expatriates, many in America and Canada, who dreamed of igniting revolution in their homeland. They were men who had tasted freedom abroad and could no longer stomach the humiliation of their people under British rule. The Ghadarites were bold, radical, and tireless. They printed newspapers, distributed seditious literature, and smuggled arms. Their cry was clear: revolt, revolt, revolt until India is free. For Udham, the Ghadar Party was more than comradeship. It was a family he had lost as a child, a family bound not by blood but by purpose. With them he traveled, spoke, and organized. He mingled with laborers in mills, with farmers in the fields, with students in dimly lit rooms. His voice, tinged with the pain of Jallianwala, stirred hearts. He was not a polished speaker, nor a writer of fiery manifestos, but his conviction was undeniable. People listened when he spoke, for he spoke not of theory but of lived anguish. The return to India. In 1927, under instructions connected to Bhagat Singh's network, Udham Singh returned to India. He was not alone. He brought with him 25 companions, men ready to risk their lives, and he carried with him revolvers, ammunition, and the most dangerous of weapons, ideas. Hidden in his baggage were copies of Godard de Gunge, The Voice of Revolt, the banned newspaper that the British feared as much as bullets. For Udham, stepping onto Indian soil with those weapons was not an act of recklessness, it was destiny calling. He had sworn vengeance in 1919, and now, armed and organized, he was one step closer. But the Empire had long arms and sharper eyes. The police caught wind of his activities. His possession of arms and prohibited literature was enough. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Years in captivity. Behind bars, time slowed, but Udham Singh's determination only sharpened. Prison was not new to revolutionaries. Many of his heroes had walked those same paths. He bore the days with quiet fury, carving resolve into his soul. He thought of Jallianwala, of Bhagat Singh who would soon kiss the gallows, of the thousands who had fallen unnamed. In the silence of his cell, he nurtured his vow. He knew his path was not to be one of speeches or politics. His destiny was more direct, more personal. Michael O'Dwyer, the man who had defended and justified the massacre, still lived, unpunished, unrepentant. For Udham, every day in prison was a reminder of the unfinished work that awaited him. The emergence of Azad. By the time he was released in 1931, Udham Singh was no longer just a survivor of Jallianwala or a member of Ghadar. He had become a man possessed by a singular purpose. He lived under constant surveillance by the Punjab police, his movements tracked, his contacts noted. Yet, he slipped through the cracks. Disguise, determination, and sheer cunning became his allies. It was during this time that he began to experiment with identities. To some, he was Udham Singh. To others, he was Ram Singh, or Mohammed Singh, or Frank Brazil. These names were not mere disguises, they were shields, tools for a man who lived a hunted life. One day, he would combine them into the name that captured his soul, Ram Mohammed Singh Azad, a name that embraced Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh alike, crowned with Azad, the eternal declaration of freedom. Toward exile, after slipping out of Punjab, he found his way to Kashmir, evading the tightening noose of the police. From there, like a ghost, he crossed borders, vanishing into the great expanse of Europe. Germany, then London. His path was winding, his face obscured in crowds. To the British authorities, he was a fugitive to be watched. To his comrades, he was a soldier preparing for a reckoning. In London, he worked menial jobs, mechanic, carpenter, laborer. Outwardly, he was a quiet immigrant surviving in a foreign city. Inwardly, he was planning. For all his years of wandering, his true destination was clear: Michael O'Dwyer. The massacre of Amritsar was not a wound that time could close. It was a fire that consumed, and Udham Singh was the flame-bearer. Part V. Across borders, across shadows, the prison gates of Punjab closed behind him in 1931, but true freedom did not await Udham Singh. He stepped out into a world where the Empire's eyes followed him at every turn. His years in captivity had only deepened the British suspicion that he was no ordinary rebel, no passing agitator. He was dangerous. And so, shadowy figures of the Punjab police trailed his movements, their reports filled with his every visit, his every contact. But Udham Singh was not a man who could be cornered. He had lived too long with loss to fear pursuit. Where others saw walls, he saw doors. Where others saw chains, he saw disguises. He began to shape himself into a figure both everywhere and nowhere. To the Empire, he would be a flicker appearing in one place, vanishing in another, always elusive. Escape to Kashmir, the noose tightened in Punjab. Every house he entered was watched. Every road he traveled marked. So, he turned his face toward Kashmir, a land of mountains and rivers that offered both beauty and concealment. In Srinagar, he found refuge. The police, unaccustomed to the terrain and distracted by their own troubles, lost sight of him. Udham had evaded them once again. But Kashmir was not a place to linger. His mission required distance, planning, and resources. From the snow-fed valleys, he slipped across borders, leaving behind the land that bound him in grief but also gave him his cause. Beyond India lay Europe, and it was there that his plan would mature. The journey through Europe. Udham Singh's path through Europe was not straightforward. He lived like a shadow, adopting aliases with the ease of a chameleon. To some, he was Ram Singh. To others, Frank Brazil, a name he would use more than once. Sometimes he was a Sikh laborer, turbaned and proud. At other times, he was a clean-shaven worker, blending in with migrant crowds. In Germany, he absorbed ideas as much as he earned wages. Revolution was not just India's cry, it echoed across continents. The 1930s were turbulent years. Fascism was on the rise. Workers protested in streets. Refugees fled persecution. Udham watched it all, a silent observer, and learned. The world was shifting, and India's struggle was only one flame in a forest fire of unrest. But his heart was fixed on one target, one name: Michael O'Dwyer, the former lieutenant governor of Punjab. The man who had defended Dyer's massacre, lived comfortably in England, respected in his circles, unapologetic for the blood of Amritsar. For Udham, every breath O'Dwyer drew was an insult to the memory of those who had fallen in Jallianwala Bagh. By 1934, his wanderings brought him to London. London, the final stage. London was the beating heart of the empire, a city of fog, chimneys, and endless crowds. Here, Indian immigrants lived in small pockets, laborers and students sharing cramped rooms, their voices echoing with dreams of home. It was among them that Udham made his base. Outwardly, he was unremarkable. He took up humble work carpentry, mechanical repairs, labor in factories. He blended in, earning just enough to survive, sharing tea and bread with fellow workers. Yet beneath that quiet mask, he was a man possessed by purpose. In small notebooks and scraps of paper, he began to map his destiny. He tracked O'Dwyer's public appearances, his speeches, his affiliations. He studied routes, halls, and entrances. He waited, never rushing, for the perfect moment. The Indian Workers' Association. In Coventry and London, Udham became affiliated with the Indian Workers' Association, IWA. A group of expatriates who gathered to discuss politics, labor rights, and the dream of independence. At their meetings, he was not the loudest voice, but he was steady, watchful. He spoke occasionally, his words shaped not by ideology alone, but by memory. Many in the IWA knew him as a comrade, a worker who believed deeply in freedom. Few, if any, knew the depth of his personal vow. He carried it silently, for to speak it openly would be to risk betrayal. His vengeance was not theirs to share, it was his alone. The mask of ordinary life. In London, Udham Singh moved through daily life as if he were any other immigrant trying to survive. He drank in pubs, worked odd jobs, and blended into the city's gray rhythm. But every action was measured, every choice calculated. He was a hunter, waiting for the prey to step into the open. He carried many names, many faces, sometimes Sikh, sometimes not. Sometimes a humble laborer, sometimes a man of education. The empire did not see him clearly because he never allowed them to. He had learned from the shadows of his childhood how to vanish, how to endure. And so, the years passed. To those around him, Udham was simply another man in exile. To himself, he was an arrow, pulled back, waiting for release. The diaries. In 1939 and 1940, he began keeping small diaries. In them, he scribbled notes, thoughts, and fragments of his plan. At times, he misspelled O'Dwyer as O'Dyer, perhaps confusing him with Colonel Dyer, the man who had ordered the actual firing at Jallianwala. Yet the distinction did not matter to Udham. In his mind, both men were guilty. Both men had blood on their hands. One had pulled the trigger. The other had defended and legitimized it. Together, they embodied the arrogance of empire. The pages of those diaries reveal a man both restless and resolute. His pen scratched out his thoughts in hurried strokes, evidence of the storm that brewed within him. The long wait. To wait for years in a foreign land, carrying such a burden, required more than patience. It required obsession. Every morning, Udham rose not simply to work but to edge closer to his purpose. Every night, he slept with the certainty that his mission was unfinished. He knew he might not live to see India free. He knew his name might be forgotten, his body executed in some foreign prison. But he did not care. His life had been claimed by the massacre of 1,919, and he would not rest until the debt of blood was answered. And so, in London, in the shadow of Big Ben, in the foggy streets and crowded halls, Udham Singh prepared. His exile was not an escape. It was the final stage of a journey that had begun in the blood-soaked soil of Jallianwala Bagh. The storm was almost ready to break. Part 6. Caxton Hall. It was the morning of 13 March, 1940 in London. The city was alive, with its usual rhythm, chimneys smoking, buses rattling, footsteps echoing on damp pavements. To most Londoners it was just another day. But to Udham Singh, it was the culmination of 21 years of waiting. That morning he rose quietly in his modest lodgings. He dressed carefully, with the calm precision of a man who knew what he must do. There was no hesitation, no trembling of hand. In his pocket, he carried a ticket purchased in the name of his wife, an alias, another mask. In his hand, he carried a book. Its pages had been hollowed, cut with patient care, leaving space for the cold steel of a revolver. The weapon itself had been bought from a soldier in a pub, an ordinary transaction for an extraordinary purpose. To anyone watching, he was just another immigrant laborer going about his day. But within him, the orphan of Sunam, the survivor of Jallianwala Bagh, the revolutionary of the Ghadar Party, the exile in London, all these selves converged into one final purpose. The gathering at Caxton Hall. The venue was Caxton Hall, a grand building in Westminster often used for public meetings. That day, it hosted a joint session of the East India Association and the Central Asian Society, later the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Among the speakers was Sir Michael O'Dwyer, the former Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, the man who had justified and defended the Jallianwala massacre. The hall filled with dignitaries, officials, and members of the public. Coats were hung, hats removed, polite greetings exchanged. The air buzzed with the usual chatter of empire policies, trade, international affairs. No one noticed the quiet Indian man who slipped into the crowd, his eyes scanning the room, his heart steady as stone. Udham found an empty seat and sat down. To outward eyes, he was attentive, perhaps even curious. But within him, the voices of 1,919 screamed. He saw the blood-soaked ground of Jallianwala Bagh, heard the cries of children, the thunder of rifles. The faces of the dead rose before him, and at their center stood O'Dwyer, calm, unrepentant, untouched. The moment. The speeches droned on. Time seemed to stretch, every word a haze. Udham's focus never wavered. His hand brushed the book, feeling the outline of the revolver hidden within. He waited, patient, until the meeting neared its end. At last, O'Dwyer rose, moving toward the platform. This was the man who had spoken of the massacre not as a tragedy but as a necessity. This was the man who had defended Dyer, who had declared the massacre correct and needed. To Udham, O'Dwyer's very existence was an insult to the memory of those who had died in Amritsar. Udham's hand moved with practiced swiftness. The book opened. The revolver slid free. He stood, steady, his eyes locked on his target. And then he fired. The first bullet tore through O'Dwyer's chest. The second struck his heart and lung. O'Dwyer staggered, collapsed, and lay motionless on the floor. The vengeance of Jallianwala Bagh had found its mark. Panic erupted in the hall, screams filled the air, chairs overturned, dignitaries scrambled for cover. In the chaos, others were wounded, Lord Zetland, Lewis Dane, and Baron Lamington among them. But Udham did not flee. He did not run. He stood where he was, calm, resolute, as officers rushed forward and seized him. The revolver was wrenched from his hand, his arms were pinned, yet his eyes remained unyielding, burning with a fire that no chains could extinguish. Arrest. As they dragged him from the hall, journalists and officials clamored. Some shouted questions, others curses. But Udham Singh said little. He had not come for spectacle. He had come for justice. The police led him into custody. The revolver, still warm from its shots, was taken as evidence. Later, it would be placed in the Crime Museum of Scotland Yard, a relic of the day when empire itself trembled under the act of a single man. A vow fulfilled for Udham Singh. There was no regret. 21 years earlier, he had stood in Jallianwala Bagh with pitchers of water, watching his people slaughtered. That night, he had sworn an oath to avenge them. On 13 March 1940, in the heart of London, he kept that vow. He knew what awaited him. Trial, condemnation, and the gallows were certain. Yet he had no fear. His life, he believed, had never been his own. It belonged to the dead of Amritsar, to the children who had fallen in the well, to the mothers who had been shot while shielding their infants. He had given his life to them long ago. In Caxton Hall, amidst the screams and the smoke, Udham Singh had written his name into history with bullets. The world would call him an assassin. India would call him a martyr. But in his own heart, he was simply a man who had fulfilled a promise. Part 7. The prisoner called Azad. The iron gates of Brixton Prison clanged shut behind him on that cold March evening of 1940. Inside the damp stone walls, Udham Singh walked with steady steps, his wrists bound, his body bruised from the scuffle at Caxton Hall, but his spirit untouched. If anything, it burned brighter. For the first time since that night in Jallianwala Bagh, he felt light. The vow had been fulfilled. To the British authorities, he was a murderer. To the Indian community in London, he was a whispered legend. To himself, he was nothing less than the voice of the dead, the name of defiance. During the initial interrogation, when asked to state his name, Udham did not say Udham Singh. He did not claim the name of his birth, Sher Singh. Instead, he looked directly at his captors and spoke calmly, Ram Mohammed Singh Azad. The officers blinked, confused. The name was strange, unfamiliar, and yet deliberate. It was no accident. It was a declaration. Ram for Hindus, Muhammad for Muslims, Singh for Sikhs, and Azad, free. In 4 words, Udham had united India's 3 major religions under the banner of freedom. His name itself became rebellion. It was as if he were telling the empire, you may chain my body, but my spirit is India, undivided, unbroken, and free. The authorities recorded it reluctantly, perhaps thinking it a mockery, but to Udham, it was sacred. He would carry that name to the gallows. The first statement. When asked why he had killed Michael O'Dwyer, his answer was unflinching. I did it because I had a grudge against him. He deserved it. For 21 years, I have been trying to seek vengeance. I am happy that I have done the job. I am not afraid of death. I am dying for my country." There was no plea for mercy, no denial, no attempt to twist the truth. He spoke as though he were free, as though the trial itself was a formality. The British prosecutors tried to paint him as a fanatic, a madman, a lone wolf consumed by hate. But those who saw him in the dock described a different figure. Calm, dignified, unshaken. He carried himself not as a criminal but as a soldier. The hunger strike. In Brixton, Udham Singh began a hunger strike. For 42 days he refused food, weakening his body but strengthening his resolve. His frame, already lean, grew frail. His eyes, however, glowed with fire. When prison guards begged him to eat, he shook his head. To live under chains, he said, was no life. Eventually, they force-fed him, pushing tubes down his throat. He endured the pain in silence, refusing to give his captors the satisfaction of complaint. Even in their most brutal methods, the British could not break his spirit. The trial at Old Bailey. On 4 June 1940, the trial began at the Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey. The courtroom was filled lawyers in wigs, journalists scribbling, policemen stationed at every corner. At the center stood Udham Singh, unbowed. His defense team included V.K. Krishna Menon and Street John Hutchinson, men who respected his courage. Yet even they knew the outcome was already written. Britain was at war with Germany. The empire could not afford to appear weak. A colonial subject who dared assassinate a former governor in London itself could not be allowed to live. The prosecuting barrister, G.B. McClure, thundered about law and order, but Udham Singh did not flinch. When asked to explain himself, he spoke plainly. He was the real culprit. He wanted to crush the spirit of my people, so I have crushed him. For 21 years, I have been trying to seek vengeance. I am happy I have done the job. I am not scared of death. I am dying for my country. I have seen my people starving in India under British rule. I have protested against this. It was my duty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some sneered, others scribbled furiously in their notes. But the words hung heavy, impossible to ignore. The judge and the jury justice Cyril Atkinson presided, his face stern, his tone cold. The jury, 12 Englishmen, listened, but their verdict was inevitable. To them, Udham Singh was guilty the moment he pulled the trigger at Caxton Hall. Yet even as they weighed his fate, Udham turned the trial into a platform. He denounced British imperialism, spoke of the suffering of Indians, of the blood spilled in Amritsar. He was not pleading for life. He was proclaiming truth. At one point, thumping the rail of the dock, he shouted, "I am proud to die, to have to free my native land. And I hope that when I am gone, thousands of my countrymen will come forward to drive you dirty dogs out to free my country." The judge tried to silence him. The court clerk shouted for order, but Udham Singh's voice carried through the chamber, louder than the gavel. The sentence. On 25 June 1940, the verdict was delivered. The jury found him guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging. Udham did not tremble. He did not bow his head. He simply smiled a faint, serene smile. For him, this was no defeat. The gallows were not chains but release. His mission was complete, his vow fulfilled. The rest was only a matter of time. The prisoner called Azad. Back in his cell, he awaited his execution with calmness that unsettled even his jailers. He read, wrote, and sometimes sat in silence for hours, as if already beyond this world. Fellow prisoners spoke of his dignity, of how he carried himself not as a condemned man but as a free one. He signed letters with his chosen name, Ram Mohammed Singh Azad. To the very end, he embodied unity, defiance, and freedom. The British believed they had captured a man. What they truly held was a symbol, an idea, an upheaval. And ideas do not die in prison. Part 8. The Gallows and the Glory. The date was 31 July 1940. Dawn crept over London, its pale light cutting through the mist that lingered in the streets. At Pentonville Prison, the hour of reckoning had come. In a small, cold cell, Udham Singh sat awake. His execution was scheduled for that morning. Yet his spirit was untouched by fear. For most men, the gallows were a place of terror, a final, choking moment between life and death. For Udham, they were a passage. His life's mission was complete, his vow fulfilled, and the rope was but the last step in his offering to his people. The final hour's guards moved quietly through the corridors, their boots echoing on stone. In the hush, one could almost hear the beating of hearts. Some of the officers had grown uneasy around Udham Singh in those last days. He carried himself with a dignity that unsettled them, a calmness that seemed almost supernatural. Where they expected panic or despair, they found serenity. When asked if he had any last request, Udham's answer was simple: "I want freedom for my people." He asked for no luxury, no indulgence. He needed nothing, for he believed his sacrifice itself was enough. In his letters, he had signed his name with defiance: Ram Mohammed Singh Azad. Even in his final hours, he embodied unity, insisting that his death was not for one community but for all of India, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh alike. The walk to the scaffold. As the appointed hour neared, prison officers came to escort him. The clanging of keys, the creak of iron doors, it was the sound of the end. Yet Udham rose calmly, his steps steady. He did not resist, nor did he falter. Some accounts describe him as almost regal in his bearing, as though he were walking not to his death but to a coronation. His executioner was Stanley Cross, an experienced hangman. Cross prepared the rope, tested the trapdoor, and carried out his grim duty with routine efficiency. But the prisoner before him was not routine. Udham's eyes met his with a steady gaze, unafraid. The last words, though exact records of his final words vary, what remains clear is that he spoke with fire. He reiterated his defiance against British imperialism, declaring he was proud to die for India. He spoke of the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, of the countless innocents gunned down. He reminded his captors that their empire was built on the blood of his people, and that his death would not silence the cry for freedom. As he stood on the scaffold, he is said to have proclaimed, "I am dying for my country. I am not afraid of death. I am proud to die so that others may live in freedom." Then, in a voice that echoed through the chamber, he shouted words that had become his anthem: "Down with British imperialism. Long live India's freedom." The execution. The hood was lowered over his face. The rope was placed around his neck. The lever was pulled. In a split second, Udham Singh's body dropped, the rope snapping taut. Silence filled the chamber. The storm that had burned within him since that fateful day in Amritsar was now released. At 8:00 a.m. on 31 July 1940, Udham Singh was pronounced dead. The aftermath. The British believed they had silenced a rebel. They thought the gallows would end his defiance. But in truth, they had ignited a legend. News of his execution traveled swiftly across the seas, reaching India, where people whispered his name with reverence. In Amritsar, Sunam, and beyond, he was not remembered as a criminal, but as Shahid-i-Azam, the great martyr. His sacrifice was seen as an offering. His death, a seed from which future resistance would grow. Even within Britain, some voices in the press acknowledged the significance of his act. The Times of London would later call him a fighter for freedom, recognizing that his bullets were not born of madness, but of the fury of a subjugated people. Immortality in martyrdom. Though his body was buried in foreign soil, Udham Singh had transcended mortality. His act at Caxton Hall had not only avenged the dead of Jallianwala Bagh but had also shaken the conscience of an empire. His death on the scaffold transformed him into an eternal symbol, a reminder that India's oppressed were not voiceless, that vengeance could reach across oceans and decades. The man who had once been a lonely orphan in Amritsar carrying pitchers of water now belonged to history. His blood joined that of countless martyrs, his name inscribed in the annals of resistance. On that morning in Pentonville prison, the empire may have claimed his life. But in truth, India claimed his immortality. The gallows did not silence Udham Singh. They amplified him, and even as his body hung still, his spirit marched on through the cries of revolutionaries, through the dreams of a nation yet to be free, through every Indian heart that dared to hope. Part 9. Immortality. The morning of 31, July 1940, closed the earthly journey of Udham Singh, but it did not end his story. In death, he became larger than life. The British had meant to silence him with the noose, to make him an example of what awaited rebels who dared defy empire. Yet instead, his name traveled like wildfire across India, whispered in the bazaars, sung in the fields, carried in secret letters. Shahidi Azam, the great martyr, was born that day. A nation remembers in Punjab. Every family who had mourned the dead of Jallianwala Bagh now saw in Udham Singh a son, a brother, an avenger. His act was not viewed as murder but as justice delayed. Justice delivered by one man's courage. In villages, people garlanded his name. In cities, revolutionaries wrote of him in leaflets smuggled through alleys. Not all leaders praised him immediately. Jawaharlal Nehru, bound by the politics of nonviolence in 1940, condemned the assassination as senseless. Yet even he could not deny the passion it stirred in India's youth. And years later, in 1962, Nehru reversed his stance, declaring, "I salute Shahid Azam Udham Singh with reverence, who had kissed the noose so that we may be free." Even in Britain, his act could not be dismissed. Some newspapers, while condemning the violence, admitted the truth. His bullets were not madness, but the expression of a people's fury. The Times of London called him a fighter for freedom, acknowledging that his deed carried the weight of a nation's pain. Repatriation of his remains. For decades, his body lay in foreign soil, buried in England, far from the land he had died for. But memory does not rest, and martyrs do not fade. In 1974, at the persistent request of Sadhu Singh Thind, an MLA from Punjab, his remains were exhumed and repatriated to India. The return was no ordinary event. Leaders and citizens gathered to receive the martyr. Indira Gandhi, then Prime Minister of India, stood with Shankar Dayal Sharma and Zail Singh to honor him. His ashes were divided into 7 urns and sent to sacred places: Haridwar, Kiratpur Sahib, Rauza Sharif, his hometown of Sunam, the museum at Jallianwala Bagh, and the Shahid Udham Singh Arts College in Sunam. Each urn was a symbol. His body may have been divided, but his spirit was whole, woven into the soil of his homeland, into the rivers, into the hearts of his people. Tributes in stone and song. In Amritsar, near the walls of Jallianwala Bagh, where he had once carried pitchers of water as a boy, a museum was built in his memory. His letters, belongings, and photographs were displayed, not as relics, but as living reminders of his sacrifice. His ancestral house in Sunam was preserved and turned into a museum. The town itself was renamed Sunam Udham Singh Wala, so that every map, every signboard, would carry his name. In Uttarakhand, an entire district was christened Udham Singh Nagar. Across Punjab and Haryana, roads, chowks, and institutions bore his name, ensuring it would never fade into obscurity. Cinema, too, paid homage. From the early film Shahid Udham Singh, 1977, to the internationally acclaimed Sardar Udham, 2021, filmmakers told his story to new generations. His face appeared on stamps, his image on statues, his life in songs. The Asian Dub Foundation sang of him in Assassin, and the Scavengers honored him in Frank Brazil, the alias he once used. In 2018, a statue of Udham Singh was unveiled at the entrance of Jallianwala Bagh itself, where he had first sworn his oath of vengeance. Draped with marigolds every April and July, it stands as a sentinel of memory, the people's martyr. But perhaps the truest tributes are not in stone or silver. They are in the annual marches on 31 July in Sunam, where ordinary people gather to garland his statues, chant his name, and tell his story to children. They are in the fact that his death anniversary is marked as a public holiday in Punjab and Haryana, not as a day of mourning, but as a day of pride. Every year, as garlands are placed and slogans of "Shahid Udham Singh Amar Ra" echo in the streets, one feels that the martyr still walks among his people. Legacy of unity. What made Udham Singh's sacrifice unique was not only the vengeance he exacted, but the message he carried in his chosen name, Ram Mohammed Singh Azad. At a time when India was increasingly fractured along religious lines, he embodied unity. To him, freedom was not for Sikhs alone, nor for Hindus, nor for Muslims, but for all. His very identity was a rebuke to the divisive tactics of empire. In an age when colonial rulers thrived by sowing discord, Udham Singh stood as a living declaration. India is one, the eternal flame. It is easy, in history, for martyrs to become statues, their fire reduced to stone. But Udham Singh resists this. His story is not only of the past, but of the present. He was not a king, not a scholar, not a wealthy leader. He was an orphan, a laborer, a soldier in exile. And yet, from the margins, he shook the empire at its heart. He reminds us that the struggle for justice is not waged only by the powerful, but by the ordinary who refuse to bow. That one man, armed with conviction and courage, can avenge a massacre and inspire millions. Immortality. On that morning, in 1919, he was a boy carrying pitchers of water in Jallianwala Bagh. On that morning in 1940, he was a man standing at the gallows in Pentonville Prison. But today, he is more than both. He is immortality itself, the spirit of upheaval, the voice of the forgotten, the fire that refuses to die. Udham Singh's story does not end with the tightening of a rope. It begins there, rippling through generations, reminding India and the world that freedom is never given, it is seized. And so, every time a garland is placed on his statue, every time a child learns his name, every time the walls of Jallianwala Bagh echo with silence, his spirit whispers, "I am Ram Mohammed Singh Azad. I am India. I am free."